Hello everybody. Today we are here for a very important video. This is my favorite video that I make every year because it is my entire year of reading in review. We are looking at all of my statistics that I've kept track of. We will be talking a little bit about my goals. We will be touching on my favorite and least favorite books of the year. All of 2020 in review. It's all gonna get summed up here and now. I'm very excited. For starters, just to get it out of the way, let's very quickly touch on my goals. I always set reading goals at the beginning of the year, and I always do a mid-year check-in on my goals, which is its own video that I post in the middle of the year where I look at my goals and I talk about how I'm doing. And I have to say, it is very consistent every year. In my mid-year check-in, if I'm on track for the goal, it'll happen. And if I'm not, it doesn't happen. The mid-year check-in truly is like, this is how it will be for the rest of the year. So if you would like an in-depth analysis of my goals, honestly, you can watch that video and pretty much everything I say in that video stays true for the rest of 2020. But let's go over my reading goals. So we have goal number 1 was to read 100 books. I did accomplish that. Goal number 2 was Project Prince, to have read half of all of the Prince books by the end of the year, which absolutely did not happen. I think I set this goal and I wasn't really thinking about the numbers. I was just like really excited about all the Prince books. I'm pretty sure in my mid-year check-in I mentioned that I had read 7 Prince books during the first half of 2020. And I honestly don't even think I read another one for the second half of 2020. So I read like 7 throughout the whole year. So that was a fail. I still plan to read all of the Prince books at some point in my life. But no, I did not read over 24 of them just in 2020. The next goal is to unhaul the same number of books that you haul, which I did do. I have pretty recently posted a video where I wrapped up my hauling and unhauling for 2020, and I made sure that that goal was completed. My next goal was to do a 1-month library ban, which I did do in February. I did not use my library at all, and I only read books that I own. I only read 3 books that month. It was a struggle, but I did it. I still completed that goal. I had an idea and I achieved it. My next goal was to read 8 books from the 1800s. I think in my mid-year check-in I had read none, and as I sit here before you in 2021, I have read none. I didn't read anything. I just didn't do this goal. My next goal was to reread at least 20 books. I did accomplish this. I had plenty of rereads in 2020. Next up was to read and review 3 books that were sent to me for review, which I did not do, and I will not be continuing on with this goal for 2021. It's kind of an old staple of mine, but it's just something that doesn't really fit in with my reading right now because I just don't request books for review anymore. My next goal, I'm sad to say, I did not complete. It was to caption all my videos. Well, let me quickly talk about the goal after that because it kind of comes into play. So my goal after that was to do a daily long form video project. This is something that I've done every year for the past couple years. I do like a full month of daily videos, and I did succeed at this goal. I posted a video every single day in the month of February, but in doing daily videos, the captions suffer. I just truly don't have the ability to make all my content so early in advance that I have time to caption my videos by the time they go up when I'm posting daily videos. So I accomplished the goal of a daily video project, but in doing that, I did not accomplish my goal of captioning all my videos because the videos that I posted during that month were not all captioned. I am happy to say that since doing my mid-year check-in, I have been doing a lot better. I've been making sure that when I post a video, there are already captions on it. And if I haven't completed the captions for a video, I will not let myself post it until they're done. And so that's like a good incentive for me to get it done. And that's been working out well so far. And then my last goal was to schedule 1 hour a week of BookTube work, which did not happen. But honestly, I'm not gonna be too hard on myself about this one, because with the pandemic in 2020, I feel like everyone's lives were so disrupted. I really just was not in the right space to be working on BookTube during a lot of 2020, so I didn't, and that is okay. But those are my reading goals for 2020. Let's see, I accomplished 5 of them, and I failed at 5 of them, so 50% success rate. Honestly, like, not horrible, but there were a lot of things that I just truly gave up on. But that's how I did goals-wise. In terms of just general reading, I feel like 2020 was a pretty good year for me. I read a decent amount of books. I feel happy about most of the books I read. I felt pretty good. I'm just gonna mention now my favorite and least favorite reads of 2020. This is something that I have done like individual videos for in the past, but sometimes I just don't feel like I have that much to say, or I have that many books that are like my top tier books. So I've really like narrowed it down. I have 4 books that were my least favorite books that were definitely not as good as everything else I read. And then I have 5 books that were extra favorites, my top tier. So my 4 least favorite books, we have the Nancy Drew Diaries. I mean, kind of the series as a whole. There were specific books that I hated more than others in this series, but this series was just such a disappointment for me. I keep reading them, and honestly, like, I will keep reading them because they're Nancy Drew books, and it's like, it's whatever. I like reading Nancy Drew books, and I just kind of want to keep going with the series, but it's not very good. It feels childish, like the writing is pretty weak, the mysteries are very lacking, like this series is just not very good, and it is a disappointing iteration of Nancy Drew, in my opinion. Another least favorite book of mine would be Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. This book I just thought was so bad. Like, it was unbelievably bad. And I don't understand why it's so popular. Like, I genuinely don't. Everything about it was just like poorly crafted, uninteresting, really bad world building. Yeah, I just thought it was awful. I also hated The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. The more I think about this book, the angrier I get. I just think it was so trite. Everything about it was bad. And then far and away, my least favorite book of 2020 is We Are Totally Normal. I don't want to go into it. There were literally so many things I hated about this book, but basically, like, the representation in this book was incredibly offensive, and I just thought it was horrible. It made me feel bad. So many aspects of this book were just intensely bad, and I hated it. So that's that. Moving on to my favorite books. We have 2 books by Alana K. Arnold, Damsel and Red Hood. Both of these are really interesting feminist fantasy books. I loved them. They were both so well written, so good, like just sucked me in. I loved the writing, couldn't stop reading them. I thought they were absolutely fantastic. I also really loved Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green. The first book in this series was one of my favorite books of the year that I read it. This one was also incredible. Like, I was fully expecting to love this book. I really like this series. My top 2 books are like by far my favorite. They just stand out above all the rest. They are The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This book was just incredible. I really loved it. I think about it all the time, and I just think it was so good. Excellent book. And then, of course, I have already said that my favorite book of the year is A Home for Goddesses and Dogs by Leslie Connor. I mentioned when I wrapped this book up that I was like 99% positive it was going to be my favorite book of the year, and it is. It just was everything to me, and I just loved it so much on such a personal level. It just was perfect. So yeah, those were the highlights and lowlights of the books that I was reading in 2020. Let's get into the statistics, because this is truly what I care about. So in the year 2020, I read a total of 151 books at a total of 42,046 pages. I believe that averages out to 278 pages per book. The shortest book that I read was a children's picture book called The Hair Book by Graham Tether. It was 29 pages. And the longest book that I read was Skybreaker by Kenneth Oppel. It was 560 pages. Going month by month, 9 books in January, 3 in February, which was that month where I had the library ban, so I just truly didn't read almost anything. And then we have 17 in March, 9 in April, 11 in May, 7 in June, 18 in July, 10 in August, 9 in September, 18 in October, 15 in November, and 25 in December. I feel like there's a very natural ebb and flow with my reading. It's just kind of up and down a little bit, but pretty good all around, except for the 1 month, but that was definitely an anomaly and there was a reason for it. This is the graph adjusted by page count. So it's pretty similar, but some months the numbers were bulked up a little bit because I was reading shorter books. But yeah, those are the page counts, mostly like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and then 2 months where I read over 5,000 pages. And then obviously February was horrible. I read 626 pages. Moving into age range, we have 12 children's books. So these are like children's picture books, 38 middle grade books, 69 YA novels, 5 books that I categorized as new adult, which just doesn't really ever exist as a age range, but I want it to, so I continue to put books there when I find them. And then the remaining 27 books are adult. This is interesting. I honestly didn't realize that I've still read this much YA. YA is pretty consistently always my highest demographic on age range, but I do think I would like it to be a little bit more spread out. Let's talk about genre next. So there were 17 books that I categorized as like unsure. I just didn't know where to put them. And most of those were children's books. So like a picture book, I just don't know how to categorize it. I also read the Dimwood Forest series this year and I truly struggled so much on where to put it because it's about talking animals. It just feels wrong to me to put that in fantasy because nothing about it is actually magical. It's just about real animals, but they've been anthropomorphized. It just doesn't make sense to me to put that in a genre. I just don't know where to put it. So we have 10% of my books, I didn't know where to put them. Next up we have poetry, which I read 1 poetry collection, which makes me depressed. We have 2 books that I said were primarily romance, 2 were horror, 3 were thrillers, 3 dystopians, 3 memoirs, 5 books that were straight nonfiction, 7 paranormal books, which honestly is more than I expected, 6 books that I categorized as speculative fiction, 4 sci-fi novels, for lack of a better term, high sci-fi, like full-on sci-fi, and then we have 5 urban sci-fi, so that would be books that take place like in our world with sci-fi elements, 16 fantasy novels, and these would be high fantasy, and then 13 that I would say are urban fantasy, so basically like real world setting versus a fictional setting. Definitely more fantasy than I expected, but it's just because I read a few series. The next category also kind of surprised me. It was historical fiction. We have 13 books, which was more than I expected as well. I didn't feel like I was reading that much historical fiction, but I will say that I feel like historical fiction is something that gets paired with other genres a lot. I did try to just mark like the main genre for most of the books that I read, but if there were 2 that were very prominent, I would mark for both of them. So I feel like historical fiction is the one that like it'll get paired with another genre. It'll be like an urban fantasy and it's also historical at the same time. But I feel like I don't actually read that much like just straight historical fiction. And then my second biggest category is of course mystery. Mystery books are something that I have been reading more and more of as the years go on, and I really love the mystery genre. And of course, 30% of the pie is still left because I read 51 contemporary books. Because, as always, like I read so much contemporary. I love contemporary. It's my favorite thing. This is a much more varied spread than it has been in the past. Like, I have read so much more contemporary in other years. So, a third contemporary and then a big spread of other genres for the year, I feel pretty good about. Next up, we can talk about my ratings that I gave books, which are not surprising. We have one book that I gave 1 star, 3 that I gave 1.5 stars, 9 books that I gave 2 stars, 15 got 2.5, 36 books got 3 stars, 45 books got 3.5 stars, 34 books got 4 stars, and then I gave 4 books 4.5 and 5 stars each. This is also another one that's kind of similar every year. Like, there's such a heavy lean on like the 3 to 3.5 stars. I do feel like I wish there was a little bit more of a balance, especially obviously with the higher end. I mean, this is what it is. This is kind of what I expected, and this is pretty consistent for me. In looking at the format of how I was reading my books, this again is not surprising at all. There was one book that I read where I listened to the audio and I read the ebook at the same time. 3 books I have as video, which is something new this year. That's because there were 3 children's picture books that I read that it was somebody like who was on a video and they read the book and showed the pictures. So like I got all of the information from the book. It is as if I read the picture book, but it was like a person in a video, like reading it to me. I read 4 ebooks, 13 physical books, and then 130 audiobooks. So 86% of the books that I read are on audio. Obviously, I love audiobooks. It's how I consume pretty much everything I read. Graphic novels, picture books, a poetry book, like those are going to be the ones that are taking up the physical slots. I also like to keep track of the publication year of the books that I'm reading. Let's see, I broke it down by decades. So we had 1 book published in the 1900s, 1 book from the 30s, 1 from the 50s, 6 books from the 1960s, 1 from the 70s, 8 from the 80s, 14 from the 1990s, and then 25 from the 2000s decade. For the 2010s decade, we have 63 books, and then technically 2020 is the beginning of a new decade. So for the 2020s, we have 31 books. But I mean, if you include like 2020 as part of the 2010s, as kind of all together, that would be 94 books. I did break it down by year once we start getting into the 2000s. We don't have any for 2010 actually, but then there's 2 for 2011, 3 for 2012, 7 from 2013, 4 from 2014, 3 from 2015, 5 from 2016, 7 from 2017, 11 from 2018, 21 from 2019, and then 31 books from 2020. And it always just shocks me that it's such an exponential increase the closer and closer it gets to the actual year that you're in, because I don't do this intentionally. I really don't care about reading new releases. There are a handful of authors where I genuinely want to read a new release from them. But for the most part, I'm perfectly happy reading backlist books because of the way my library adds new releases all the time, and that's what I see, because of the way that everybody else reads new releases all the time, so that's what I get recommended to me. This is not new, but this always blows my mind how consistent it is that I'm mostly reading new releases. Next, we can look at time period. So there were 30 books that I categorized as just not applicable. They took place in a world where we're not on the same timeline. So 20% of my books were irrelevant. But other than those, we have 21 books that took place in the past, 94 books that took place in the present, and 6 books that took place in the future. So this is not really surprising. I mostly read contemporary, obviously, so most of the books that I read take place in the present. I know that I've said, like, I want to read more sci-fi, and usually sci-fi will take place, like, in the future. So it bums me out a little bit to see that so small, and obviously we saw the stats on the sci-fi that I read. I only read 4 sci-fi and then 5 urban sci-fi books. It just was not a lot of sci-fi this year, which is something that I would like to do more of in 2021. Next up, let's talk about location. This is always such a struggle for me to track, but I really love looking at the stats for this. For both countries and states, which we'll get to in a second, I do include any section of the book that takes place in a location. So if there's like a book where there's a lot of traveling, I try to include everything. But we have 29 books that, again, just like are not applicable. They took place in a different world. 10 of the books that I read, I could not figure out what country they took place in. I just don't know. But other than those books that I could not figure out, we have my number 1, of course, is the United States. 99 books that I read took place in the United States. The vast majority of the books that I read take place in the US. A part of me feels like this is a problem, but part of me is like, I mean, I live in the United States. I read books that are published from American publishing companies. I read through the American Public Library system. I just don't know. But yeah, 99 books I read took place in the United States. The next highest level we have is 8 books. 8 books took place in England and 8 took place in France. We have 4 books that took place in Canada and 4 from Australia. 3 in Ireland, 3 in Italy, 3 in the Netherlands. And then we have 2 in Mexico, 2 in Japan, 2 in Norway, and then 1 book each for Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Puerto Rico, St. Croix, which is part of the US Virgin Islands, Ecuador, Qatar, Nigeria, Ukraine, and Brazil. So this is what my map looks like. It is not a lot of variation. There's not enough diversity of countries when I'm looking at this. So that's something I would like to improve upon. Next, let's move on to US states. So obviously the majority of the books that I read took place in the United States. So of the 99 books that I read that took place in the US, we have 13 unknown states. These were books that I just have no idea what state they took place in, and I could not figure it out. But I was able to track down pretty much everything else. I will make note that I do have some zeroed in locations, but I could not specify the state they took place in. We had a book that took place in like the prairie lands. Pretty sure this was Sarah Plain and Tall, that book took place in the early US prairie. I was able to narrow down 1 book to either Wisconsin or Illinois, but I don't know which one. Another book I was able to narrow down between North Dakota and Minnesota, but I don't know which one. There was 1 book that for sure took place in New England, but they did not say what state. And then I had another book that had a trip to Disney, but they did not specify whether it was Disneyland or Disney World, so I don't know whether it was California or Florida. But anyway, let's get into the books where I have a confirmed location for all of them. Of course, this was my top state last year, and it was my top state this year. It seems that I mostly read books set in New York, so I read 26 books set in New York. Next up, again, this is not surprising. I believe this is the same last year as well. The next step after New York is California with 24 books. By far, most of the books that I read take place in New York or California. It honestly is kind of boring at this point. Please pick a different state. It's not interesting to set your book in New York or California. So after those 2 states, next up we have 7 books each for Massachusetts and New Jersey. Next we have 5 books each for Texas, Tennessee, and Colorado. Moving on to 4 books each for Vermont, Pennsylvania, DC, Georgia, Louisiana, and Washington State. The states that I read 3 books each from include Oregon, Ohio, Connecticut, Kentucky, and Alaska. Next up is going to be books where I read 2 books each from Nebraska, Virginia, Missouri, Indiana, Maryland, New Mexico, North Carolina, and Minnesota. And then the remaining states that I read 1 single book each from are going to be Montana, Alabama, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Idaho, Florida, Illinois, Arizona, Kansas, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Nevada. So this is what my map looks like of the different states that I was reading. Honestly, this makes me happy. I like that I've read from so many different states. Like the majority of the United States is filled in here. Next up, let's talk about diversity. So there are lots of different diverse elements of books that I was reading, and I think it's really important to keep track of them and go into them and kind of look at what you're doing well at and what you're not. So the first thing we can talk about is gender. I have looked at the gender of the author, of the protagonist, and then also the cross section between them. So first up, in looking at the gender of the authors that I was reading, I read 103 books by female authors, 41 books by male authors, and 5 books by non-binary authors. This is not really surprising to me. I mostly read books by female authors. I have no problem with this, and this is not something that bothers me at all. Of course, it would be nice to see more non-binary authors on the list. In terms of the protagonists of the books that I was reading, 97 books had female protagonists, 32 books had male protagonists, and then 16 of the books that I read had multiple protagonists that covered more than one gender. Most of the time it was male and female, but I did read some books that had non-binary protagonists alongside male and female protagonists, but it was a mix in those books. This, again, not surprising that I read mostly books about female protagonists. In terms of the cross-section, 55% of the books that I read were written by a female author with a female protagonist. 6% were a female author writing a male protagonist. 10% was a male author writing a female protagonist. And 14% was a male author writing a male protagonist. 9% was a female author writing from multiple perspectives. 3% was a male author writing from multiple perspectives. And then of my non-binary authors, 3 of the books were a male protagonist, and 2 of them had a multiple protagonist perspective. I feel like this is very convoluted for me to explain, but I hope that makes sense. In terms of diversity of sexualities, 26 books that I read had a queer protagonist. 27 of the books that I read had significant queer representation with a secondary character, but it was not the protagonist. So the books with a queer protagonist might have also had secondary representation, but the biggest representation that they had was a protagonist. And then the next level would be 27 books where the most representation was a secondary character. And then 98 of the books that I read didn't have any significant queer representation. It's possible that some of those books had a very minor character who was queer, but if it isn't somebody who really is a secondary character rather than a tertiary character, I didn't include them. A little bit of a bummer. 65% of the books that I read had no significant rep, so that's more than half, obviously, which is not super great. Not super surprising, but a little sad nonetheless. In looking at books and how they represented people of color, we have 43 books with a protagonist of color, 43 books where the most representation was a significant secondary character, and then 65 books with no significant representation of a person of color. So this one is a little bit better than the queer rep, but it's still not amazing. I do think that it's pretty interesting that for both of these stats, it was really balanced of protagonist and secondary, because we had 26 queer protagonists and 27 with secondary representation. And then with people of color, it was 43 for both of them with protagonist and secondary character. I don't know what that means, but I just think it's interesting. I will say that, of course, there are plenty of books where I've marked it as no representation, but it might not have been relevant. Like, for example, I think I mentioned earlier, the Dim Wood Forest series. That was 7 books that I read that were all about animals. And like, obviously, it's not a white person, but it's not a person of color either. So it doesn't count as representation. With like queer representation, you know, there's plenty of books that I read where there's no romantic interest. So it's like the character's sexuality is never explained, but it still is like something that is so important and can enrich a story so much. So it's like, if the author has the opportunity to include representation, it's like, why wouldn't they? I don't know. I also keep track of whether the authors I'm reading from are people of color or not. And I have to say, my stats for this year are so disappointing. I only read 33 books that were written by people of color, and then 116 books by white authors, which is 78%, which is like so bad. Some years I have paid extreme deliberate attention to the ratio of the authors I read, but this year I wasn't really thinking about it super prominently, and it shows that like I just wasn't making the effort. So that's something that I definitely will be changing in 2021. And then in looking at the specific identities of the actual characters that were represented in the books that I was reading, for queer representation, I kept track of like what was represented in each book. This is both primary characters and secondary characters. And I only mark like one instance per book. So like if I read a book that was about a group of friends and they were all lesbians, that book would count as lesbian representation. Like I would not mark for every single character. I hope that makes sense. But of the different sexualities represented of the books that I was reading, there were 12 books where there was a queer female character, but it was not specified what her identity was. And then 8 books that I read where there was a male character who was queer and it was not specified. We have 16 books with lesbian representation and 19 books with gay representation. 6 books with a male bisexual character and 11 books with a female bisexual character. We have 5 books with a trans female character and then 1 book with a trans male character. 8 books with non-binary representation and 5 books with asexual representation. And that includes 2 books that I read that had demisexual representation. I included it under that umbrella. I like to break this up by gender just because I think it is interesting to look at how, like, with non-specified representation, it's more likely to happen with a female character, whereas when you have the label like lesbian or gay, it's like I am gay, you're more likely to have a gay male character than a gay female character. Obviously, this is just out of the limited scope of books that I personally read, but I feel like this probably does kind of apply to a lot of other books in the grand scheme of things. And it also is interesting to see that I'm reading way more books about trans characters who are women rather than men, and I'm pretty sure this was an issue that I pointed out last year in my stats as well, that like the representation of trans characters, I mean, to begin with, obviously, is minuscule, but when you do have a trans character, it's 5 times more likely to be a woman than a man, at least in the books that I read. Obviously, like I said, minuscule numbers, so like this is not like a good stat to be going off of, but that is a trend that I've noticed now for 2 years in a row. Next up, let's talk about disability and mental illness. We have pretty close numbers for these. I had 24 books with mental illness representation and 23 books with disability representation. So 84% of my books just didn't have significant mental illness representation. 85% didn't have significant disability representation. This really comes at no surprise to me because disability rep is so rarely prioritized in fiction, and that's it for all of like my diversity statistics. I do still have a lot of other random things that I kept track of. We can look at the types of books that I was reading. It's not super interesting. This is pretty much what you would expect. 80% of them were just novels. Like I mostly read fiction. It's mostly just regular books. 13 of the books that I read were children's picture books, so that's kind of its own category. I only read 4 graphic novels, which is very disappointing, and I would like to be reading more, but I just was never really in a graphic novel mood this year. I read 4 novellas, 3 memoirs. 2 books that I read were epistolary in their form, so they were written in letters. 1 book was a poetry collection. I had 1 book that was written in verse, and I had 1 collection of essays, and then I also have 1 book listed as nonfiction, which doesn't sound right because I know I read more nonfiction than that, but I don't know. This is just what I wrote down, and I don't know how to adjust this, but this is roughly the form of the books that I read. It's mostly novels, which is to be expected. Of the books that I read, I owned 18 of them at the time of me reading them, which means 88% of the books that I read were unowned while I read them. We all know that I pretty much only read audiobooks from my library, but I still just find this to be disappointing because I would like to be reading more of the books that I actually own. Even if it is on audio through my library, I'd like to be getting through my own books. And then in terms of whether it was a reread or not, I had 31 rereads. So my goal, I think, for 2020 was to read 20 rereads, and so I read 31, which is pretty good. Obviously, most of the books I read for the first time, 79%. But I mean, that's fine. I always try to keep track of whether I'm reading translated books or not, but it never really works out because 99% of the books I read, literally 99%, were not translated. I read 2 translated books. One of them was translated from Dutch and one of them was translated from Norwegian. And that's it. That is just sad. I have information about whether I was reading standalones or part of a series. 54% of the books I read were standalone books, and then 46% of the books I read were part of a series, which honestly surprised me. I didn't realize I read that many books in series. It's very close to being half of the books that I read. In terms of the actual placement in the series, I read 23 books that were the first in a series, 18 books that were the second, 11 books that were the third, 6 that were the fourth, 3 books that were the fifth, 1 book that was the sixth, and then 2 books that were the 7th in a series. So, I mean, pretty much what you would expect. It starts out really high with the first in a series, and then it gets progressively lower. I did also sneak in 2 books that were 0.5 in a series and 1 book that was 1.5 in a series. So I just had little novellas in there. And then I also did read 1 book that was the 18th in a series, 1 that was the 31st in a series, and 1 that was 136 in a series. And those were all Nancy Drew books, because Nancy Drew books, you can truly read them in any order. In looking at authors, whether I was reading them for the first time or whether I had read books from them before in the past, 60% of the books that I read were written by authors that I had already read, and 40% of the books that I read were authors I was reading for the first time. I did keep track of the statistic of whether I cried while reading a book or not, and this is one that I am not going to be keeping track of in 2021 because I just find that it's not super interesting to me, and it also is very hard for me to remember if I am filling out the statistics a week or a month later after I've read the book. I truly just can't remember sometimes if I've cried or not. So I feel like this is probably the most inaccurate. It's very much an estimate. But what I've landed on is that I cried while reading 43 books. 72% of the books I read, I don't cry during. I do enjoy a book that makes me cry. And then I've also kept big lists of a few things. Something that was new for me this year, I kept track of all of the audiobook narrators that I was listening from. To be honest, this isn't super interesting. It's basically just a lot of different narrators. I'm not going to read them all off to you, but I will just include a clip of the actual page in my notebook where I was keeping track of this so you can see all of them. As you can see, it's mostly just individual audiobook narrators. Most of the ones where there's more than one book is from a series. So Georgiana Marie read a lot of the Nancy Drew diaries, I think, so she's on there multiple times. John McDonough narrated the Dimwood Forest series. The highest number that I have is actually a full cast narration. I read 9 audiobooks that were done by a full cast. I really enjoy full cast audiobooks, so that was nice. What are some other multiple ones? Kate Rudd narrates the Truly Devious series. Sandy Rustin narrated the series by Meg Cabot, like the mystery series that I read by her. Trini Alvarado narrates the Tortall books. Jesse Bernstein narrates the Percy Jackson books. So they are all on there multiple times. I also want to point out that everyone with a star by their name means that it is the author of the book who narrated their own audiobook. So I just wanted to designate those separately from the rest of the list. So actually, when I discount all of the series that I read, my top 2 audiobook narrators of the year, we have Rebecca Soler, who narrated 3 books, and I believe they were all standalones. And then my number 1 audiobook narrator was Priya Ayar, who narrated 4 books, and I believe all 4 of those were also standalones. And those are 2 audiobook narrators that I'm familiar with. I know their names. I can envision their voices in my head. They narrate a lot of books that I read, and I enjoy both of them, so that's nice to see. I also like to keep track of the repeat authors that I read. Again, this is mostly going to be heavily skewed toward series because every series that I read, the author is going to be on my list multiple times. But I will just quickly rattle off all of my repeat authors of 2020. So first level with 2 books each. I read 2 books from Bruce Coville, Anne M. Martin, Paula Danziger, Hank Green, Brandy Colbert, Nina LaCour, Nancy Farmer, Jerry Spinelli, Sarah Gailey, and Rainbow Rowell. I read 3 books each from Alana K. Arnold, Ray Carson, and Kenneth Oppel. I read 4 books from Holly Black. I read 5 books from Maureen Johnson, Meg Cabot, Rick Riordan, and Dr. Seuss. I don't have 6 books from anyone, but I do have 7 books from Avi, and that would be the Dimwood Forest series. I've mentioned that so many times in this video now. And then my top authors, it's a tie between 2 authors, and I believe that both of these authors have been my top author of the year in previous years, like maybe 2016 and 2017 or something like that. But I read 8 books from Carolyn Keene and Tamara Pierce. And I mean, again, it is because of series. So Carolyn Keene is obviously not a real person, but like, she's my top author of the year. I read 8 Nancy Drew books this year. And then Tamara Pierce writes the Tortall books. So I read 8 books from her. I read 2 different 4-book series from her. I mean, very on brand for me. I obviously love both of them. Those are my top authors of 2020. If we exclude books in series, I'm pretty sure that my top author is gonna be Alana K. Arnold because I read 3 standalone novels from her. And then the last statistic that I have is publishers. And this is something that I started tracking last year. It was a new addition to my book stats. And I found it to be very unhelpful, uninteresting last year, but I was like, I'll do it again just to have 2 years in a row, just to make sure that it wasn't like a fluke. But no, I really dislike tracking publishers. I don't find it interesting. It offers me no insight. I thought it would, but it really doesn't. So I'm not going to be tracking this in the future. I'm not really going to say much about this, but again, I will just include some footage of like what that page looks like in my notebook so you can see that it's just an absolute mess of publishers. And like, I read 1 to 5 books from most of them. It's not interesting. So that's that. I think that's it. Oh my gosh, we're done. I've been filming for so long. I think this is going to be a really long video, but like, of course it is. It is the summary of an entire year of reading. If any video I make is going to be long, it's going to be this one. If you have stuck around through this entire thing, I appreciate you very, very much. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was interesting and fun for you, like it is for me. Please let me know your thoughts on anything that I have shared. We are finally done with 2020. I know that this is all so late. That is just my way of booktube. Maybe things will be different this year, but I did it. I wrapped up 2020. That was my year in reading. Goodbye.